Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm overwhelmed by the kind words that Nilesh has said about me. I don't think that I deserve all of that, but I'm very happy to be here to talk about one of the most burning issues in India today, and that is the issue of corruption and this whole anti-corruption campaign that has taken place in India recently, which has galvanized a very large section of Indian society, cutting across all strata of society. All sections of people have got energized, mobilized by this campaign. But before I talk about the campaign, I think we need to understand what the background of this campaign was, what is the situation in India which led to this campaign and which eventually galvanized and mobilized so many people in support of this campaign. And in order to understand that, we need to, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the state of affairs in India, but I would still, for those who may have a somewhat misleading impression from the kind of picture that is often projected, particularly by the business media, and which is sought to be projected by the government, by the Indian government, I think people need to understand what the true picture and true reality of India today is. Of course, the Prime Minister and the business media never tires to tell us of the fact that India's GDP growth rate has increased considerably in the 2 decades of economic liberalization, and it is now almost 9%. And this is treated as a great progress from the period prior to economic liberalization. But if we just scratch the surface and try to see how this GDP growth, certainly GDP has grown in the way in which it is calculated traditionally, but if you try to see how this GDP growth has benefited the vast majority of the people in the country, we get a very different and indeed disquieting picture. If you look at the Arjun Sen Gupta report, which was officially commissioned by the Government of India a few years ago, he points out that 78% of India's population lives on less than 20 rupees a day. Now 20 rupees is not enough to get even 2 square meals, let alone pay for housing, healthcare, education, or various other basic needs of people. You also find, and these are official figures, that more than 200,000 farmers have committed suicide in India in the last 10 years, almost in the last 1 decade. That's absolutely unprecedented. 200,000 people committing suicide because of economic distress. You also find that not just the absolute numbers, but the percentage of the Indian population which is not being able to afford even the basic nutrition and food that is required has also increased during the period of economic liberalization. Those are studies which have been done by a very eminent economist at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Dr. Utsa Patnaik. So what has happened? Why is it that there is this huge disconnect between GDP growth and its translation into public welfare or the welfare of the vast majority of the people. And in order to understand that, we will be able to see what is the connection of this with corruption. Now, if you look at what happened as a result of economic liberalization, and just see mining of mineral resources as a case study of that, one will be able to make all these connections as to what is the connection between economic liberalization, corruption, and the actual state of affairs in the country today. I'm just giving this as a case study which will illustrate this whole thing fairly well. Now, prior to economic liberalization, mining of mineral resources, which is the natural wealth of the country, was not allowed for commercial profit by private corporations. It was occasionally allowed by private corporations, but only as for captive mines for their downstream industry. But it was not allowed as a standalone industry where a mining corporation could just be given mining leases to extract mineral resources for profit. After economic liberalization, that was allowed. In the late 90s, that was allowed, and the result has been that a very large number of mining leases have been given all over the country to various different mining corporations for extracting mineral resources. In the state of Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh alone, which are the tribal states where most of the forest resources in the country are, and also the mineral resources of the country, 200 MOUs were signed virtually overnight by the chief ministers of those states with various mining corporations a few years ago without any transparency, giving them large tracts of forest land for mining of mineral resources. Now, the volume of mineral resources which exist in the country are enormous. So, if you allow unbridled extraction of mineral resources by private corporations or by whoever for profit, it can certainly give you enormous GDP growth, because the entire revenue from the mining is factored into your GDP growth. Just the bauxite reserves of Odisha alone have been estimated to be $2.2 trillion, which means if you gave all the bauxite reserves to private mining corporations and they could certainly extract all the reserves within 20 years, that itself would translate to a 10% GDP growth or an 8% GDP growth on account of just bauxite mining from one state of Odisha alone. And therefore, but how does that GDP growth benefit the people and the country? Less than 1% of that GDP as a result of mining comes to the public exchequer by way of royalty. Justice Santosh Hegde, who is the former Lokayukt of Karnataka, has recently, just prior to his retirement, given a very voluminous report about iron ore mining in Karnataka, where he has shown, given the economics of this iron ore mining. He says that the cost of extraction of iron ore in Karnataka is on an average about 300 rupees a ton. The cost of transporting it to the port is another 300 rupees a ton. From the port, most of it is being exported to China at an average price of 6,000 rupees a ton, which means a 900% profit on the cost of extraction and transportation for these mining corporations. The government used to get only 27 rupees a ton as by way of royalty, which has now been increased to 61 rupees a ton, which is still 1% of the gross revenues. The rest of the money goes by way of profit to these mining corporations and their owners, who of course share part of it as bribes with those who have given them the mining leases, the ministers, etc., who have granted the mining leases, the ministers' bureaucrats, as well as those officials right down the line who allow the extraction, the forest officials who allow the extraction, transport officials who allow the transportation, etc. So the money goes right down the line. So this money, which certainly is factored into your GDP growth, is going in the hands and in the pockets of a corrupt corporate and government mafia. It is just fattening a corrupt mafia in the country, and it has only created these Reddy brothers who controlled iron ore mining in Karnataka, became so powerful as a result of the huge amounts of money, literally lakhs of crores that they earned on account of iron ore mining in Karnataka, became so powerful that even the chief minister, when he tried to remove them once from their cabinet, could not do so because they took away, they could buy over most of the MLAs and thereby bring down his government. And ultimately he had to go down on bended knees and beg for forgiveness from them. But what are the other impacts that this mining has? Now, in order to extract, because most of the mineral resources are under forests, where tribals live, mostly tribals are living in those forests, you first have to displace the tribals. Now, these tribals are dependent on their livelihood. Their only source of livelihood is that land and the forest. You deprive them of that by giving them some monetary compensation, which is never enough for them to earn an alternative source of livelihood. And therefore, they have only one choice. Their choices are either to just go away and starve to death, or fight to save their land. And many of them are indeed fighting to save their lands. All across the country, wherever the government, whether it is for POSCO in Odisha, or in Kalinganagar for Vedant, or in many other places where the government is trying to physically take over this land to hand it over to these mining corporations or for special economic zones or otherwise, every kind of resistance movement is going on by the local people to save their land. And therefore there are millions of mutinies going on and brewing in the country as a result of this. When they resist peacefully, very often the government resorts to force. So there is firing lathi charges over this peaceful resistance by these people in order to clear that land for being handed over to these mining corporations or otherwise. And that leaves these people again with only two choices. Either to again run away and starve to death, or to pick up arms and join the Maoists, because the Maoists have waged a fairly successful armed rebellion, particularly in these tribal states. And therefore, many of them, or several of them, have decided to pick up arms and join the Maoists. And that is why the Maoists have grown in numbers, their strength has grown, and their recruits are all from these tribal areas whose lands have been forcibly taken away or who have been brutalized by the state. So you have succeeded in creating a huge social problem. And then, even if you manage to get the land from these tribals, you need to cut down the forests in order to get to the mineral resources, so the forests are cut. Now this bauxite is an important source of water because it's an aquifer. There are these bauxite mountains in Odisha which are the source of all the rivers which flow from these mountains. If you remove the bauxite, you are virtually drying up all these rivers. And then you are polluting the existing water bodies, because this mining is a highly polluting activity. You are polluting the water, you are polluting the air. Now they say that no, this GDP growth will trickle down because this mining will provide employment to these people. But the number of people who are provided employment, of course this employment in the mining industry is back-breaking, health-destroying kind of employment. But whatever it is, even in this employment, the number of people who are employed is less than the number of people who are displaced. So therefore you are not even providing employment, even this bad employment, to even those people who are being displaced. And yet, the government continues to say that no, this is absolutely essential for GDP growth, for the economic progress of the country. And why? So now if we try and see why these policies of allowing mining for commercial profit, after all, mineral resources are the natural wealth of the country. Justice Santosh Hegde in his report has pointed out that if iron ore mining goes on at the present rate in Karnataka, which is the richest iron ore bearing part of the country, all the iron ore of Karnataka will be exhausted in less than 20 years' time, leaving nothing for future generations if we will exhaust everything during this generation itself. So, why have these policies been adopted by the government of allowing the plunder and the loot of natural resources of this country for commercial profit by private corporations who have become, as I said, a mafia as a result of this? Because of corruption. Because this business, you see, in the license permit Raj, you could only hope to give bribes out of the profits that you could hope to earn from your business for which you got a license. We were told that this economic liberalization would end corruption because the license permit Raj would come to an end. But economic liberalization has given rise to a new kind of business, and which is the business of transferring capital assets, natural wealth of the country, land, and the assets of public sector corporations. IPCL, which had 3,000 crores as cash in their bank, was sold off to Reliance for 1,600 crores, which had just land and buildings worth 16,000 crores. That whole company was sold off for 1,600 crores. Same thing happened with BSNL. Just their real estate and the cash in bank was more than the price at which the whole company was given away to the Tatas. Land has been, large volumes of land have been transferred to private corporations, acquired from the poorest people in the country and transferred for just real estate development. I'll give you just one example. They are making this Taj Expressway which runs between Noida and Agra. For this expressway has been privatized and handed over to JP Industries for making that highway, from which they will recover their cost from the toll. But in addition to the 6,000 hectares required for the highway, which has been acquired, that land has been acquired by the government and handed over to JP Industries, they have acquired another 25,000 hectares, 4 times that amount, from these poor farmers who live in that area, and handed it over to JP Industries for just commercial real estate development. They are allowing change of land user from farming, from agriculture to any use that they want to put it to, whether it is shopping malls or industry or housing complexes, whatever. So that land is being acquired from the farmers at 5-6 lakh rupees an acre, has been acquired from them at 5-6 lakh rupees an acre, handed over to JP Industries at 25 lakh rupees an acre, 25 lakh rupees an acre, who are in turn changing the land use and giving it for these residential complexes, commercial complexes, etc. for 20 crores an acre. So what you have done is you have set up you have started a new kind of business in the guise of privatization and economic liberalization, which is the business of transferring capital resources owned publicly by the state and transferring them to these private corporations for their commercial profit. Now, this transfer of capital assets is being done often without any transparency. Even when there is some transparency, there is enough scope for manipulation. The bidders are usually few and it can always be fixed. We have found that it can always be fixed so that the government gives it to whoever they want, whoever gives them a higher kickback.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
I knew it. Sorry.
So this has created this business of transferring capital resources which are worth any amount, unlimited. As I said, if the natural wealth of this country, India has enormous natural wealth, and if all that was to be just handed over to private corporations for profit, the volume of this business is potentially unlimited. Because it's not that iron ore or bauxite has to be consumed in India. Most of it, 2/3 of the minerals which are being extracted from India are being exported mostly to China. It's not even being used in the country. So, and you have this is the only business which has 900% profits. That means you get it at just 1/10 of its actual price. This is exactly what happened in this 2G auction or 2G transfer in this telecom scam. I mean, spectrum is also a natural resource, a public resource owned by the country. Now this was transferred to these telecom companies at 1/10 of its market price. So therefore this new business which started as a result of economic liberalization, which is the business of transferring capital assets to private corporations for profit, this business has a built-in huge incentive for corruption, has provided and created a huge incentive for corruption. And that is why we find that precisely during the period of economic liberalization, when we were told that corruption would reduce because you are ending the license permit Raj, you have found that corruption has increased by leaps and bounds. In Bofors was the biggest scam of the 80s, which was 64 crores. We are now every other day coming across new scams worth tens of thousands of crores. And we have, on top of it, we have created this kind of mafia in the country which sits on top of the entire ruling establishment. So this is one of the reasons why corruption increased so greatly. Now the other reason is that we did not address or did not create adequate disincentives for corruption, to check corruption. That is, we did not fix our anti-corruption agencies and we allowed them in fact to weaken and decay. If we look which are the anti-corruption agencies or the main anti-corruption agencies in the country, there are primarily three. We have the CBI, which is supposed to investigate offences of corruption and prosecute corrupt public servants. We have the Central Vigilance Commission, which is also supposed to exercise vigilance over public servants and take disciplinary action or recommend disciplinary action against them. And then we have the judiciary, where the corrupt public servants need to be prosecuted in order for them to be sent to jail. Now all three of them have been allowed to be weakened and have been allowed to decay or corrupted. The CBI, the problem was that the CBI is under the administrative control of the very people that it is supposed to investigate for corruption. So today in the 2G scam, one issue which has arisen is that the need to investigate Mr. Chidambaram's role in the 2G scam, because ultimately the decision for spectrum pricing had been left to Raja and Chidambaram. The whole issue had been withdrawn from the group of ministers and left only to these two ministers who jointly took this decision that yes, spectrum can be given away bundled with this license at the old prices of 2001, when they knew jolly well that the market price had become 10 times. Now the question is, can the CBI impartially and effectively investigate Chidambaram when all the officers of the CBI are IPS officers whose cadre controlling authority is the Home Minister? So the Chidambaram decides whether these officers will be transferred or charge sheeted or promoted, and therefore how will they be effectively able to investigate him? So this is a problem which is endemic with the CBI, that the CBI is controlled, ultimately administratively controlled by the very people whom it is supposed to investigate. So there was a built-in conflict of interest, and that is why it was decided that we need an independent, completely independent authority in the shape of a Lokpal, which would be able to impartially, independently investigate all these corrupt public servants, and that this authority should be completely independent of the government. And naturally, when the CBI officers themselves become corrupt, since they are accountable again to the same government, and because of this conflict of interest, that government does not rein in corruption within the CBI also. Then you have the CVC. Now the CVC was given functional autonomy from the government by a Supreme Court judgment in that Hawala case, which was translated into the CVC Act. But the selection of the CVC was still left to the government. So you have a selection committee consisting of the Prime Minister, Home Minister and Leader of Opposition who select the CVCs. Even the Leader of Opposition, who has been a minister in the past and hopes to become Prime Minister in the future, usually does not want a robust watchdog in place in the Central Vigilance Commission. So they have all colluded to appoint weak and pliable persons as Vigilance Commissioners. In the last case, of course, the Leader of Opposition objected to the appointment of this Thomas as the Chief Vigilance Commissioner, but the government still went ahead and appointed him, though he had a criminal charge sheet for corruption pending against him. Yet that person was appointed as the chief. Ultimately, the Supreme Court quashed his appointment. And then you have the judiciary. Now the judiciary has two problems. First is that it's become dysfunctional because cases don't get decided for long periods of time. The prosecution of Sukhram, he was found with a lot of cash, several crores stored in sacks under his bed some 18 years ago. And the case against him is still pending in the High Court while he's been out on bail all this while. And it will not get over before he dies. Even if the High Court is able to decide it, the matter will go up in appeal to the Supreme Court where it will remain pending. And therefore, this is one of the problems with the judiciary, that it cases just don't get decided. So that is why in our JAN LOKPAL bill we have provided that the government and the judiciary must increase the number of special judges to try these corruption cases, to ensure that the Lokpal will make an annual assessment of the number of courts required to try these corruption cases which they are sending up. And the number of judges and the special courts to try these cases must be increased by law so that all the trials are over within a year and the appeals are also over within a year in the High Court. So, this is one problem. The second problem with the judiciary is that the higher judiciary or the judiciary itself has become very corrupt. And the main reason for that is that the higher judiciary is totally unaccountable. So while the lower judiciary is accountable to the high courts, the high courts and the Supreme Court are not accountable to anybody. Nobody has any administrative or disciplinary jurisdiction over the high courts and the Supreme Court and their judges. And this was done to provide for independence of the judiciary, unfortunately. And that it was thought at that time that this process of impeachment would suffice to provide for some measure of accountability for the higher judiciary, but unfortunately we have seen that impeachment is a totally impractical process. And the result has been that till today, not a single judge has been impeached, though everybody acknowledges that there is enormous corruption in the higher judiciary. The second problem was also that, again created to some extent by the Supreme Court, that Supreme Court in that Veeraswamy's judgment said that in order to protect the independence of the judiciary, because the investigation of corruption cases against judges is also done by the CBI and by the regular police, and these agencies are controlled by the government. Therefore, in order to protect the independence of the judiciary, before the police or the CBI can investigate a judge, they must require the prior written permission of the Chief Justice of India. And this permission has hardly ever been given. Even refused in cases by honest Chief Justices. Chidambaram, when he was Commerce Minister, once sought permission of Justice Venkatachalaya, who was a very honest Chief Justice of India, for investigation of a very corrupt judge of Calcutta High Court, Ajit Sen Gupta. But that permission was also not given. Because even honest Chief Justices feel that as head of the judicial family, it is their duty to protect members of the judicial family. So there is an inbuilt conflict of interest there, where you have given this power to decide whether a judge should be even investigated or not to just one person, that is the Chief Justice of India. And many of the Chief Justices of India have themselves been very dishonest. And therefore they have refused permission for their own dishonest reasons. But I am saying that even honest Chief Justices have occasionally not given permission. So the result is that you cannot take any disciplinary action against a corrupt judge, you cannot even investigate a corrupt judge for corruption, and therefore they have become totally unaccountable. And that has led to a situation where corruption has proliferated in the higher judiciary and it has trickled down to the lower judiciary as well. Because naturally they will not be able to rein in corruption of people under them if they are themselves corrupt. And that is why in our JAN LOKPAL bill we had provided that, look, this Lokpal, which is being set up as a completely independent authority, independent of the government and independent of the Supreme Court, at least this should be able to investigate judges of the higher judiciary for corruption. But the government has been opposing even this. The judges have been opposing this also. The judges have been saying that no, judges can only be accountable to themselves, or judiciary can only be accountable to itself. I mean, this self-accountability is an oxymoron. It has not worked in the Bar Association. The Bar Council is also a kind of body of lawyers which is supposed to hold lawyers accountable for misconduct. It has not worked there. It has not worked with the Medical Council, which is also an elected body of doctors which is supposed to hold. You always need an independent authority to hold anybody accountable. And since the Lokpal was being created as an independent authority, there was no reason to exclude the judiciary from the jurisdiction, or higher judiciary from the jurisdiction of the Lokpal. But the government, because of the pressure of the judges, has agreed to exclude, and in their bill, in the government's bill, the higher judiciary is excluded from the purview of the Lokpal. Of course, there are much more serious problems in the government's Lokpal bill than just this, than the fact that the judiciary has been excluded, the Prime Minister has been excluded, virtually the MPs have been excluded, and the entire lower bureaucracy has been excluded from their jurisdiction. But in the government's bill, the fundamental problem is that the Lokpal is not even independent of the government, because firstly, the government will select the Lokpal, because 5 out of the 9 members of the selection committee in the government's bill are nominated by the government. In our bill, we have a very broad-based selection committee to select the Lokpal. We have only one person from the government, that is the Prime Minister. Only one other politician, that is the leader of opposition in the Lok Sabha. We have the Chief Election Commissioner, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, 2 judges of the Supreme Court, 2 Chief Justices of the High Court, and the last 3 chairmen of the Lokpal as members of this very broad-based selection committee who will go about selecting the Lokpal in a very transparent manner. In the government's bill, they will select the Lokpal. Not only will they select the Lokpal, but they will control the Lokpal by having the power to suspend Lokpal with them. In our bill, the government has no power to suspend the Lokpal. They can only make a complaint to the Supreme Court against any citizen, can make a complaint to the Supreme Court against any member of the Lokpal, and the Supreme Court will inquire into the matter and then can take, either can suspend the member or thereafter remove the member or whatever. But in the government's bill, the government has retained the power of suspending the Lokpal with themselves. Therefore, you have a government-controlled Lokpal whose jurisdiction has also been severely limited, and on top of that, they have made giving a false or frivolous complaint to the Lokpal to be a very serious criminal offence, which is likely to deter even honest complaints being made against corrupt public servants. So, what the Lokpal bill tries to do, the JAN Lokpal bill, is to set up an institution which is functionally, financially, as well as in terms of its method of selection, independent of the government. And this institution is empowered, fully empowered to investigate any allegation of corruption against any public servant from the Prime Minister to the peon. All the central public servants would be investigated by the Lokpal. The state public servants and the public servants of local bodies would be investigated by the Lok Ayukts, which would have to be set up on similar lines in the states. And accountable. Now, a lot of people have asked us, how will you ensure that the Lokpal itself does not become corrupt, this JAN Lokpal? So in our bill, we have built in multiple layers of accountability for the Lokpal. Firstly, the Lokpal would be required to function with complete transparency, which means every detail of every investigation conducted by the Lokpal would have to be put up on a public website for everybody to see, so that people can see whether the investigation has been properly done, honestly done or not. Secondly, any citizen can make a complaint against any member of the Lokpal to the Supreme Court. And they can make a complaint against all the officers under the Lokpal to either the Lokpal or to independent complaints authorities which would be set up in every state to investigate complaints against these officers. In addition to that, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India would be required to do an annual financial and performance audit of the functioning of the entire Lokpal institution. And that report will go to the Public Accounts Committee of Parliament, where again it will be scrutinized. And lastly, every order of the Lokpal would be subject to judicial review before the High Court and the Supreme Court. So there are multiple layers of accountability of the Lokpal which hopefully will prevent corruption in the Lokpal. As I said, the government has brought a completely different bill, and I have called it the Promotion of Corruption Bill rather than the Lokpal Bill, because in my view it will actually promote corruption. It will prevent even honest complaints against corrupt public servants from being made. However, the bill is now before the Parliamentary Standing Committee, and they are hearing the views of different people, and we expect and we hope that several amendments will be suggested by the Standing Committee in the government's bill to bring it more in line with our bill. However, we still cannot say to what extent it will be brought in line with our bill. The government says it will eventually come up before the Parliament in the winter session, and thereafter it will be debated there and finally passed in the winter session. Probably it will be, because I think the government has also understood that they are having to pay a heavy political price for opposing this Lokpal bill. Because clearly there is enormous public support and support of public opinion in favor of the JAN LOKPAL bill. This movement, the Lokpal or the anti-corruption movement, this phase of the anti-corruption movement, has received enormous public support cutting across ideologies, parties, stratas of society. It has received support from the rich, the poor. Every kind of people have come in support of this movement. And in my view, there are three principal reasons for that. The first is that the background was such that everybody was groaning under corruption. Everybody had become the victim of corruption somewhere or the other at some level or another. The poor street vendors, juggi dwellers, rickshaw pullers were also having to pay bribes for just being allowed to continue to vend on the streets or live in the juggis, or for getting their ration cards and food entitlements, etc. On the other hand, there was this spate of very highly publicized major scams in the country which had been publicized by the media a great deal. So therefore that had set the stage where corruption had become a major issue in the country. When thereafter people saw that there was a credible person and a credible team of persons who were proposing a solution to this problem, which appeared to be a viable, practical solution to this problem in the shape of a Lokpal legislation, then I think a lot of people got galvanized, motivated, energized to come and participate in this campaign. And I think that is really the major benefit of this campaign. Quite apart from what kind of legislation we succeed in getting as a result of this campaign, I think the big gain from this whole movement and campaign has been the fact that a very large section of society in the country has got galvanized and motivated to come and participate in this campaign. So people who had started feeling cynical or hopeless or helpless also came out, and they started feeling hopeful and empowered that perhaps by their public participation in this campaign they could change something. They could change perhaps the future of the country. And this kind of positive energy which has been generated among a very large section of society is, I think, the main gain and the main benefit of this campaign. And going forward, you see, one thing is about what happens to the Lokpal bill, which is certainly important, but not the only thing. There are all kinds of, as I pointed out, there are all kinds of other problems. There are structural injustices facing the country which cannot be addressed by the Lokpal. Every problem is not related to corruption of this kind which can be addressed by the Lokpal. Policies have been made, laws have been made like the Special Economic Zone Act, which allow the government to just take away forcibly the lands of the poorest people. The Land Acquisition Act itself allows the government to take away the lands of the poorest people in the country and hand it over to the richest corporations. That is not a problem, that is not a policy which can be addressed by the Lokpal. That needs a policy change. Now, there are two options in how such policy changes could be brought about. One is, of course, that people again get energized and come out and campaign against each of these policies and seek changes in each of these policies relating to land acquisition, relating to mining, and so on. And the other is to make an institutional change to make democracy more participatory in the country. Because ultimately what is happening is today this model of representative democracy that we have adopted in India has been shown to have various problems. Those people who are elected, firstly, the whole process of electing representatives has become such that only those who have a lot of money or belong to these big political parties which have a lot of money are capable of getting elected. We have found that whenever good candidates or good people have come together, formed some kind of organization and set up candidates, they have fared very badly. Even though they are seen as persons who are very clean, honest, committed, and so on. So there is this initial problem with this form of elections and representative democracy. The second problem is that even if you manage to elect proper people, even then they can be easily corrupted by these commercial vested interests, corrupted or influenced by the commercial vested interests when the stakes in the kind of decisions that they make are so huge for them. And therefore, we need to move towards a more participatory form of democracy in the country where the views and the wishes of the people at large can be taken into consideration in major government decisions, government policies, as well as laws that are made. So you have, and that can easily be done, because today technology has become such that you can set up internet kiosks in every village in the country through which people can be asked to vote on any issue that you want to put up for voting, even if there are different issues being put up for voting every day. People can vote every day on one issue or another. If it's a local issue, the people in that local area can vote. If it's a state issue, the people in that state can vote. If it's a national issue, all the people in the country can vote. Now there are two challenges for this model. One is that the issue which is put, or the issues, how you frame the issue that is going to be put up to vote is important, and therefore the issues need to be framed by a neutral authority in a fair manner, which fairly represents the various major contending views that have been put on the table. In the Lokpal bill, for example, some 3 or 4 main contending options have come up. Each of those, there is one in the government's bill, there is one in the bill prepared by us, and there is one in this NCPRI bill. These are the 3 main proposals that have come. A few others may have come. Now, what you will have to see is, if you want to put up the JAN LOKPAL bill for a national referendum, you will first have to see what are the issues that need to be aggregated and taken as a package, and what are the issues which are standalone, which can be disaggregated and can be voted upon separately, so far as this bill is concerned. So some authority has to do that, then frame the issues that are put up for voting, and thereafter people can be asked to vote upon it, and on the basis of what the people want, of the kind of bill that people want, the matter could be decided. People have raised the question, look, most of the people will not understand what this Lokpal bill is all about. Now that is true, that most of the people may not understand. Now what will they do? Some of them will not vote. Others who may not understand will still vote, but they will vote on the basis of whom they trust. If they find that Anna Hazare is saying one thing and they trust him, they will vote according to him. They find that the government is saying something and they trust the government, they will vote according to that. If they find that Aruna Roy is saying something and they trust her more, the people will vote according to that. That is what happens even when you choose your representatives. You don't know who the representative is or what his track record is very often. Usually you don't know that. You just vote on the basis of the party that you trust. And you may not trust that representative to represent your views on everything. You might trust him to represent your views on some particular issue, but not on every particular issue. But unfortunately, the nature of representative democracy has become such that the same representative decides everything on every issue for the next 5 years, and therefore that needs to be changed. This is really the biggest challenge, not just for India, but I think globally, even in America. This is the real challenge of democracy, or this is the real crisis of the kind of representative of democracy that we are facing today. Today we have these Wall Street protests going on, not just in New York, but across the country. And the protests are precisely this, that unfortunately these financial firms of Wall Street have come to have so much influence over government policies, etc., that government policies and government decisions are being made in their commercial interest rather than in the public interest or in the interest of the people. So this kind of corrupt capture or capture of governance by commercial vested interests is a problem that we are seeing everywhere, wherever we are following this model of representative democracy. That is not to say that big money will not play any role even if we were to democratize this and make democracy more participatory and have referendums, etc., or let the people take decisions, because those with money can influence even the people in general through advertising, through other kinds of influence as well. But still it will be better than the present system, and this is the real challenge going forward. However, the key for all this, if we want to change other policies, or if we want this kind of fundamental change to be brought about in the country of making democracy more participatory in the country, the key is really that if this huge public participation that we have seen in this corruption campaign, if this can be sustained and if this can be made even more widespread, if we can really get large sections of people in the country, particularly the youth, the educated youth, to come out of their homes, take an interest in all these public issues, participate, discuss them, and raise their voices just in the manner in which they did in this corruption campaign, then we may indeed succeed in bringing about a real revolution in the country. So, as I said, the situation in the country is quite alarming. If it is not corrected, not checked, the country is headed to all kinds of serious social problems. Of course, there are already problems of grinding poverty, etc., but we are going to see increasing social conflict in the country. If that has to be reversed, then we need to sustain this public participation, and that will have to be done. We do not have to, if we wait for Anna Hazare or this team Anna to lead the movement on all these other issues, etc., then we will be really missing the bus. I think what we need to understand is that people who have got energized and activated during this campaign need to take up the initiative and the leadership themselves, wherever they are, and participate in this, and then perhaps we can see, because that will have its own dynamics, it will throw up its own leadership, etc. It is not really realistic to expect Anna Hazare or Team Anna to lead the country on all these larger issues that face the country. Thank you very much.